18-year-old Aria Hale had always known her place in the world was somewhere far beyond the dusty plains of her isolated hometown. Yet she never expected that her journey would collide with the legendary warriors of the United States Navy SEALs, who operated in shadows and lived in a realm of impossible standards. But fate has a strange way of pushing certain people into arenas they seem far too young for. And so when Aria, an unassuming teenage marksmanship prodigy who had spent her childhood dismantling and rebuilding rifles while other kids collected stickers, was invited as a temporary civilian attachment to assist in a remote joint training experiment, the SEALs didn't hide their skepticism for even a second. They saw an 18-year-old girl with a ponytail, freckles on her nose, and a rifle case too big for her shoulders, and decided unanimously that this experiment would last a day before being quietly shut down. But Aria had learned long ago that people's laughter didn't sting when you knew exactly who you were and what you could do. So, as the team, SEAL Team Kestrel, gathered around the range for their usual qualification drills, they didn't bother pretending to take her seriously, whispering jokes loud enough for her to hear, calling her kid attachment mascot, and claiming her rifle looked bigger than her career, and Aria simply breathed slowly, her fingers brushing the cold steel of her custom-built bolt-action rifle nicknamed Ghost, a weapon she had modified piece by piece until its precision matched the rhythm of her heartbeat. And when Chief Rosen barked for everyone to fall in, he introduced her with a smirk, saying, "This is Aria Hale, civilian attachment, here to observe, not to compete. Don't worry, boys, she won't slow us down," prompting a ripple of laughter through the group. But Aria only nodded politely, offering a soft, "nice to meet you," while quietly deciding that she would let her accuracy speak for her, because words were never her weapon of choice. Her bullets were, and as the drills commenced, each SEAL showcased his skill with impressive confidence, hitting targets from 300 to 800 meters, some even pushing to 900, their shots crisp, disciplined, controlled, the kind of shooting that came from years of experience and hardship. And when Rosen finally called her forward, half mocking, half curious, saying, "All right, attachment, let's see if you can even hit paper," Aria knelt down without hesitation, adjusting her bipod with practiced fluidity while the team whispered behind her, betting discreetly on how badly she'd miss. But the moment she settled into position, something shifted. Her breathing slowed, her heartbeat steadied, the world around her fell silent, and she locked onto the 800-meter steel plate with a calmness that made Rosen stop mid-smirk, because while her body was small, her presence suddenly wasn't. And when she squeezed the trigger, Ghost fired with a soft, clean crack that seemed almost anticlimactic until the distant steel sang with a perfect dead-center impact that made the entire line of SEALs fall silent for the first time since she'd arrived, and before their surprise could surface into words, she cycled the bolt and fired again and again. 5 shots in under 12 seconds, all hitting the exact same point. The grouping so tight the spotter had to zoom in twice because he thought the screen was frozen. And that was the moment Rosen's eyebrows lifted in genuine shock. But Aria wasn't finished. She asked calmly if she could push to 1,000 meters, and Rosen, now intrigued, gave her a nod, and she dialed her scope with delicate precision before sending another rapid series of shots downrange, each one slamming the far steel with unwavering accuracy. And murmurs rose among the SEALs, confusion, disbelief, a hint of awe, until one of them muttered, "No way, she outshot all of us." And Rosen, now silent, simply stared as Aria reloaded, her expression still soft, almost shy, as if unaware she had just shattered their entire perception of her within 2 minutes. But the real test came when Rosen decided to challenge her with a course that even the SEALs struggled with. The Falcon Run, a brutal long-range gauntlet stretching across uneven terrain with targets from 400 meters to 1.3 kilometers, timed, scored, and rarely completed flawlessly even by veterans. And while Kestrel team members traded glances, whispering that the kid would crumble under pressure, Aria only tightened her gloves, slinging her rifle over her shoulder, and followed Rosen to the starting point, where he explained the rules, expecting at least a flicker of fear, but she simply nodded and said, "Ready," with a steady calm that made the chief tilt his head slightly. Then the buzzer sounded, and Aria moved, not with panic or frantic energy, but with a quiet confidence, taking each firing position with speed that belied years of discipline, dropping targets one after another with an efficiency that left no room for doubt, the spotters calling out her hits faster than they'd ever done for a trainee. And by the time she reached the final 1,300-meter target, a near-invisible silhouette tucked into shadows, she hit it on her first attempt. Dead center, no wind drift, no error. And when the final buzzer echoed across the range, the scoreboard didn't lie. Aria Hale had just broken the course record held by a SEAL sniper with 9 years of combat experience. And as she stood there, breathing softly, brushing dust off her knee, the entire SEAL team stared at her not with mockery anymore, but with respect, disbelief, and the dawning realization that the teenage attachment had outshot every single man on the field. And Rosen, stepping forward slowly, shook his head with a grin of utter admiration before saying, "Aria, you didn't just pass. You embarrassed us." To which she only gave a small, humble smile and replied, "I wasn't trying to." And the SEALs, now cheering for her rather than mocking her, gathered around to ask her questions. How she trained, how she built her rifle, how she controlled her breathing. And Aria answered shyly and used to attention, but grateful. And before the day ended, Rosen asked if she'd consider joining their advanced civilian program someday, telling her the door would always be open because talent like hers was once in a decade. And as the sun dipped behind the ridge, Aria walked back toward the helipad with a feeling she hadn't known in years. Acceptance, purpose, belonging, and she looked back at Kestrel team, now her supporters rather than her critics, and whispered to herself, "Maybe that's where I belong next." And before boarding, she turned to her camera, recording a message for her audience, and saying, before the blades roared and lifted her into the fading light, carrying with her the whisper of steel hitting steel and the echoes of a day she would never forget. And as the helicopter blades carved circles through the orange-stained sky, Aria lowered her gaze for a moment, letting the hum of the engine vibrate through her chest while the events of the day replayed in her mind with startling clarity, because even though she carried herself calmly, inside her heart was still catching up to the reality that she had stood next to one of the world's toughest special operations teams and proven herself without asking for permission, validation, or sympathy. And the memory of the SEALs' stunned expressions kept surfacing, especially the look on Chief Rosen's face when she hit the 1,300-meter silhouette like it was nothing but a leaf resting in her backyard, and she found herself smiling despite the exhaustion creeping into her shoulders. Because for once in her life, she didn't feel like a ghost hiding behind her rifle or a misunderstood kid with a strange talent. She felt seen, respected, and strangely understood. And as the helicopter banked left, over the rugged training valley, she watched the sun melting beyond the horizon like a dying ember, casting shadows that stretched far across the terrain she had conquered hours ago. And she wondered if maybe this was how destiny whispered to people, not with loud declarations or dramatic signs, but with a quiet sense of rightness blooming in your chest, telling you that you had stepped into the first chapter of who you were meant to become. And while she rested her cheek against the cold frame of the window, she remembered the early years when her father, an ex-army marksman who never talked much but loved her fiercely, would sit with her behind their barn, guiding her hands gently on the wooden stock of an old hunting rifle, teaching her not just how to shoot, but how to breathe, how to listen to wind like it was a voice, how to read silence like it was a map. And his words echoed inside her now. Precision isn't talent, Ari. It's honesty. Your bullet always reveals what you truly felt in the moment you fired. And she wondered what he would think if he saw her now, out shooting SEALs, breaking military-grade records, and carrying a rifle she built with her own hands. But the thought filled her with warmth instead of fear, and she whispered into the rhythmic hum of the helicopter, "I hope you'd be proud," before glancing at the camera still recording beside her, blinking its tiny red light as if encouraging her to share more. But she switched it off gently, deciding that some moments were too personal for the world, especially the ones that shaped her soul. And when the aircraft finally descended toward Forward Camp Echo, its floodlights slicing through the dusk. She straightened up, preparing herself for whatever reactions awaited her there, because she knew word traveled fast in military circles. Especially shocking, unbelievable stories like an 18-year-old out shooting an elite SEAL team. And by the time the helicopter touched down, a small crowd had already gathered at the landing pad. Instructors, support staff, a few Marines from the adjacent training wing, all murmuring among themselves with curiosity sharpened into disbelief. And when Aria stepped out, a faint breeze tugging at her hair, the murmurs softened into stunned silence as Rosen and his entire team climbed out behind her, all wearing looks that were no longer teasing, skeptical, or dismissive, but deeply respectful, even protective in a way that surprised her. And it was Rosen who stepped forward first, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear as he said, "If anyone here still thinks she's just a teenage attachment, watch the footage." And he motioned for one of the tech officers to replay the recorded shots on the tall field monitor nearby, where the crowd watched in dead silence as Aria's bullets carved a perfect constellation of precision across targets most soldiers struggled to hit once. And as whispers rose, some amazed, some confused, some borderline shocked, Aria felt her ears warming with embarrassment, because she had never liked attention, never liked being in the center of a crowd, but at the same time she couldn't deny the spark of pride that flickered in her chest when a Marine whispered, "Holy hell, she beat every SEAL on the field." And another muttered, "This kid's a monster with a rifle." And Rosen, standing beside her with a rare grin, added, "I'd say she's better than half our operational snipers already, maybe more than half." And though Aria tried to hide her smile, she couldn't help the slight upward curve forming at the corner of her lips, especially as the SEALs behind her nodded proudly, some even giving her friendly shoulder taps like she'd been part of their unit for years. And one of them, Kieran, a tall, broad-shouldered operative with sharp eyes, said, "Kid, you realize you're going viral on the internal network, right?" And Aria groaned quietly, rubbing her forehead, because the last thing she wanted was attention. But Kieran laughed and added, "Don't worry, it's all respect this time." And Rosen finally motioned for everyone to disperse, telling Aria, "Come with me. I need to show you something." And she followed him through the dimly lit corridor of the camp building, past offices and briefing rooms, until he stopped in front of a reinforced door labeled Range Analysis, where he inserted his code and pushed it open, revealing screens filled with ballistic data, shot trajectories, environmental scans, and system logs capturing every millisecond of her performance. And Rosen pointed to the graph showing her hit pattern, saying, "This doesn't happen by accident, Aria. You're not just good, you're exceptional." And she stared at the data, the perfect clusters of her shots, the steady pattern of her breathing intervals, the way her timing barely fluctuated even at impossible distances, and she felt a strange heaviness settle in her chest. Not negative, but overwhelming, like she was finally seeing herself the way others saw her. And Rosen stepped closer, lowering his voice as he said, "You may only be 18, but I've trained snipers for 20 years, and I've never seen potential like this. Ever." And Aria swallowed, unsure what to say, because no one had spoken to her like that before, certainly not with such gravity. And Rosen continued, "I don't know what your plans are after this program, but if you want a future in long-range operations, civilian or otherwise, I'll endorse you personally." And Aria blinked in surprise, stunned by the offer, but even more stunned by the sincerity behind it. And before she could respond, Rosen added with a faint smirk, "Just promise me one thing. Try not to embarrass my team too badly next time." And she laughed softly, shaking her head as tension melted into warmth, and together they left the room, the hallway glowing faintly under the night lights. And as Aria walked toward her temporary quarters, the weight of the day pressed onto her shoulders in the most satisfying way. And she knew that when she uploaded her journey to her Brave stories, asking her viewers to subscribe and tell her where they were watching from, she wouldn't just be sharing an adventure. She would be sharing the moment her life truly began. And as Aria sank onto the narrow cot in her temporary quarters, the adrenaline from the day still coursing through her veins, she replayed every moment in her mind, From the skeptical glances of the SEALs when she first stepped onto the range to the stunned silence that had fallen over forward Camp Echo as her bullets found every target with surgical precision, and though exhaustion pulled at her eyelids. She couldn't sleep immediately because her thoughts were alive, buzzing with a mixture of disbelief, triumph, and an almost frightening clarity about her own potential. And she reflected on all the early mornings spent in the barn with her father, every lesson in patience, every whispered instruction about reading the wind, calculating angles, and respecting the rifle as an extension of herself, realizing now that all those solitary hours had led to this. A day when an 18-year-old girl had outperformed some of the most elite soldiers in the world, and she felt a curious mix of pride and humility because she had done it not for recognition, not for applause, but because she was compelled by the quiet, persistent urge to see just how far her skills could take her. And as she stretched her legs and ran her fingers along the worn fabric of her jacket, she thought about the SEALs, about the camaraderie she hadn't expected but had found in their unspoken approval, about Kieran's teasing comment and Rosen's rare grin. And she realized something profound. She had crossed a threshold, a boundary that separated those who simply trained from those who transcended expectations. And now the question loomed larger than ever. What would she do with this gift, this uncanny ability that seemed to exist beyond her years, beyond her current circumstances, beyond anything she had dared to imagine? And as she considered the answer, she remembered the other attachments she had encountered in her training. Trainees, civilians, volunteers, all striving for mastery but none, carrying the same relentless precision that had guided her hands today. And she knew that to continue on this path, she would have to push further, learn more, test herself against challenges that most adults would shy away from, perhaps even face real-world operations where the stakes were no longer measured in points or drills, but in life and death. And the thought made her pulse quicken with both fear and exhilaration. Because for the first time, she felt truly alive in the rawest sense of the word. And she thought of the stories she would one day tell her viewers on her Brave Stories. Not just to show off skill, but to share the journey, the discipline, the sweat and quiet resilience it took to stand where she stood. And she imagined the messages flooding in from subscribers, young men and women from around the globe who would write to her, asking how she overcame doubt, ridicule, and fear, and she felt a surge of responsibility, knowing that her example could ignite courage in others, just as her father's quiet teachings had ignited her own. And she envisioned the next day, when the SEALs would return with new drills, more challenges, perhaps even attempts to stump her with scenarios designed to break concentration. And she smiled faintly, already anticipating how she would adapt, because one thing was certain. Her resolve had been forged today in fire, and nothing could shake the precision, patience, and composure she now carried as an unspoken armor. And as she rose from the cot to gather her gear for a late-night review session, checking ballistic charts, cleaning her rifle meticulously, and reviewing the drone footage of her own shots, she felt a calm determination settle in her chest, a quiet assertion that this was only the beginning of something far larger than any one day, any one team, any one range. And she resolved that when she returned to the field, she would not merely replicate her performance. She would exceed it, pushing the limits of what an 18-year-old civilian attachment could achieve, because her ambition was not for trophies or accolades, but for mastery, for the relentless pursuit of perfection that coursed through her veins like a second heartbeat. And as the camp lights flickered softly against the night, she reflected on the fleeting moments of doubt from earlier in the day. The laughter, the mockery, the whispers of kid and mascot, and realized they had all been catalysts, sharpening her focus, fueling her determination. And when she finally sat at the small desk, reviewing wind speeds, bullet drop, and range data once more, she allowed herself the tiniest hint of satisfaction, knowing that she had not only proven herself to the SEALs, but had glimpsed the extraordinary potential lying dormant within her own spirit. And she understood, with a clarity that was almost painful in its intensity, that her journey was no longer a series of experiments or attachments. It was a calling, a path that demanded courage, discipline, and an unwavering commitment to excellence. And she knew that every subscriber, every viewer on her Brave stories who followed her journey would witness more than skill. They would witness transformation, courage, and the quiet, relentless heart of someone who refused to be underestimated. And as she finally leaned back in her chair, exhausted yet exhilarated, she whispered softly to herself, "This is just the beginning," knowing deep inside that the next shot, the next challenge, the next day could be harder, but would also define her in ways she was only beginning to comprehend. And in that moment, surrounded by the faint glow of the screens, the scent of gun oil, and the distant hum of camp activity, Aria Hale felt, for the first time, that she truly belonged in a world that had once seemed far beyond her reach, and that belonging was not given. It was earned, one precise, deliberate, unwavering shot at a time, and she vowed silently to continue, to improve, to inspire, and to never let doubt dictate her path, because she was no longer merely an 18-year-old civilian attachment. She was Aria Hale, the teenage sniper who had outshot an entire SEAL team, and that truth resonated through her like a bell, clear, ringing, unstoppable, as she prepared to embrace whatever came next, fully aware that history, respect, and her own destiny were now intertwined in a way that no one, not even the most skeptical SEAL, could ever deny. And as the night deepened and the camp fell into quiet, she drifted into a light, restless sleep, dreaming not of what she had accomplished, but of everything she still had to conquer, knowing with absolute certainty that her story, her legacy, and the journey of her brave stories was only just beginning. And when Aria woke the next morning, the memory of the previous day weighed on her not like fatigue, but like a mantle, a responsibility she could feel pressing gently yet firmly on her shoulders. And she knew that the respect she had earned from the SEALs, the astonishment of Forward Camp Echo, and the reactions of her viewers on her brave stories were all pieces of a larger puzzle she was only beginning to understand. And as she packed her rifle meticulously, checking each component with the practiced precision that had carried her through impossible drills, she reflected on how far she had come. From the quiet, shadowed corners of her father's barn, learning the language of wind and steel, to standing on a range where legends of the military had been humbled by her hands. And she realized that her journey was never about proving others wrong. It had always been about discovering her own limits, testing them, and then surpassing them with deliberate focus and courage. And as she stepped outside into the crisp morning air, feeling the sun touch her face with a warmth that mirrored the fire in her chest, she saw the SEALs already gathering for their morning brief, their eyes meeting hers not with skepticism, but with acknowledgement and admiration. And Chief Rosen approached, his face a mixture of pride and the quiet awe that came from witnessing something extraordinary, and he placed a hand lightly on her shoulder, saying, "Aria, you didn't just impress us, you reminded us why we fight, train, and strive for excellence every day." And she nodded softly, humbled but unshaken. And as they walked together toward the training grounds, the team moving around them like shadows, she reflected that every whisper of doubt, every smirk, every mocking word had been necessary, because without it, she would never have realized the magnitude of her own abilities. And she carried that truth with her as she set up for a demonstration of skills for new recruits and instructors. Her hands steady, her breathing calm, her mind focused with laser clarity, and as each shot rang out, crisp and unerring, the crowd around her was drawn into a rare silence that only mastery could command, and she felt the rhythm of her body, the pulse of the rifle, the invisible alignment of earth, air, and steel all converging in perfect harmony. And in that moment, she knew without doubt that her life had changed forever, not because of fame, accolades, or viral videos, but because she had faced challenge without fear, performed with integrity, and remained true to herself. And as she lowered her rifle after the final shot, the impact resonating in the air, she looked up at Rosen and the assembled SEALs, who broke into quiet, heartfelt applause, and she realized she was no longer an attachment, no longer the kid they had mocked. She was a sniper, a warrior in her own right, and a symbol of courage for those who dared to dream beyond their apparent limitations. And she felt a swell of gratitude for every teacher, every mentor, every moment of struggle that had brought her here. And she knew that when she shared this journey with her viewers on her Brave Stories, asking them to subscribe and comment on where they were watching from, she would not just be telling a story of bullets and precision, but a story of resilience, determination, and the quiet power of believing in oneself. And as the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the training field, Aria Hale, the 18-year-old who had once been underestimated, now walked forward with unshakable confidence, ready to face the challenges of the future, embrace her destiny, and inspire anyone willing to listen. And with that, her chapter at Forward Camp Echo closed not with an ending, but with the triumphant understanding that she had earned her place, carved her name into the annals of skill and courage, and left a legacy that would be remembered by those who had doubted her. And she smiled, softly, whispering to herself, "This is only the beginning," knowing in her heart that she had become everything she had ever set out to be, and more, as the world around her stretched endless, full of possibilities, and she stepped into it, unafraid, unstoppable, and utterly herself, the teenage sniper who had outshot an entire SEAL team, a story that would live forever on her Brave Stories.